So we're continuing with our review of modes of survey data collection, and now we're going to talk about the what's becoming the most important and widely used method of gathering survey data, which is the use of the internet or web-based surveys. So this is something that I think we're all familiar with by now, but it's important to realize that even in the last 5 or 10 years, it's been a major change. The What's gone from sort of a somewhat early experimental method of doing surveys is now kind of exploded into a whole new industry with companies that specialize in doing web internet surveys, all kinds of new software that people can use to do internet surveys, and kind of a ongoing experimentation with ways of recruiting people and sampling people online in order to engage them in this kind of online research. So one way in which internet surveys are quite useful is if you already have an established client group or group of employees or parents of a school system where email contact is an ongoing part of the organization. And so in a sense, if you have people's email addresses already, it's very easy to then survey them using an internet survey. I should It's a general population, or if you don't have people's email addresses, then people have experimented with what's methods called internet access panels, which is when you recruit people possibly through the telephone or through mail or through handouts or through pop-up kind of ads and intercept ads on web searches. You recruit them into a panel. Essentially, you get them to sign up and give their email address in order to later recruit them for online research. And this has become a big industry. There are companies out there that specialize in recruiting a broad panel of people, gathering their email addresses, verifying their identities, that sort of thing, and then making these panels of people available for research. Now, overall, this kind of internet or mail survey has a lot of advantages. Mostly, well, one of the big ones is obviously economic. It's one of the most inexpensive ways to gather data. Thousands and thousands of responses can be gathered with very minimal costs. They also can be very fast surveys. Often the responses come in quite quickly after the invitation to be in the survey was sent. And an interesting advantage is the ability to use the technology to present much more interesting and engaging sort of material for people to respond to. So you can show pictures and images, videos, and have people respond to a wide range of media. Also, the questions themselves, the kinds of questions can be much more interesting. There are all kinds of sliders and heat maps and things that people can use to indicate their responses. So the technology, again, is rapidly evolving, and it's very interesting. Things are coming out in terms of ways of presenting and gathering data online. Rather, presenting and gathering responses to various information online. But there are some important disadvantages. There are very often low response rates. People don't trust the internet. They're worried about spam. It's hard to convince people that a survey is important if it just comes in the form of a cheap email invitation. So the usual problems of reaching people online tend to result in low response rates. There can also be some technological issues. People have different browsers or different devices and different internet connections, and surveys sometimes don't work. Internet surveys sometimes don't work as smoothly as as promised, and you can lose people or have partial data and that kind of thing. So, but overall, this is again emerging as the new predominant mode of data collection, and it's something to keep your eye on and learn more about. Now, not all surveys involve people or households. There are very important surveys that are done by the government and by governments around the world that involve establishments, meaning businesses or organizations. So there are surveys of manufacturers, surveys of units of local government, surveys of institutions of different kinds, like schools or prisons, and so data is collected on these establishments, not just on households and people. But that in some ways brings up interesting challenges for how to reach these sorts of institutions and how to get them to provide good information. So one of those challenges is what the respondent should be. I mean, organizations don't talk or don't respond to surveys. People do. So who in the organization should represent the organization, and how much do they know, and who's the right person to answer the questions? And it could be several people in an organization that may be needed to provide accurate information. And then it takes extra care to kind of follow up and approach these organizations, and often a mix of modes is best. Sort of some combination of mail or phone outreach or even a visit to the organization can be useful to try to get a good response rate. Now, another kind of unique survey that is a little different is something called a longitudinal survey, also called a panel survey. And that's the idea where you essentially track people over time and you repeatedly survey them, sometimes over many years. And there's some famous examples of this. There's in the United States, there's the panel study of income dynamics and the National Educational Longitudinal Study, or NELS, and there's a British household panel study. There's a panel study in Germany. Many countries have some form of panel study, and a lot of medical studies attempt to follow people over time using a longitudinal survey. Let's talk about the issue of crafting a questionnaire, or the skill of crafting a questionnaire. I mentioned this at the beginning as one of the important steps of the survey process. A good questionnaire is clear and relatively easy for someone to respond to, and to respond to accurately, and therefore it produces good data. And so it's a very important part of the survey process to develop a good questionnaire, to craft a good questionnaire. But it's a bit art as well as science. So it's something that takes practice, and it's what what I want you to do in your second assignment is to sort of begin developing that skill of how to write a good survey questionnaire. So I'm going to give you some advice on that. The book covers it in more detail, but just to give you a sense of how to approach this task of crafting a questionnaire. So one thing is to start with the purpose of the survey and to develop an outline of survey items. Don't start with questions. Start with what it is you want to know, the data items or the variables that you want to measure. Start with an outline of that, because the drafting of questions is something separate. You want to know what you want to measure before you figure out the way to measure it, right? And then another trick is to think about what are the one or two or three most important questions that you really need from your survey. Because something that I've noticed that tends to happen with people when they make questionnaires or draft questionnaires is they start writing a lot of questions but forget to answer or include the key questions. So I always recommend to, in your initial draft, start with the one or two questions that you really, really want answered, just to make sure they get in there. Another tip is to prepare some mock tables and charts. In other words, pretend you have data and you're making up a table and you're making up charts, and then check to see that the questions that you ask in your survey will actually produce the data that will give you the tables and charts that you want to end up with. Because in a way, you're designing the survey to end up with some results that matter to you. And if you have those results sort of in a tangible form, like tables and charts, then you can, check whether the survey you're creating will actually, give you that data. Now, another really important tip is to look for prior surveys on your topic. This is really important and sometimes counterintuitive because people are afraid of borrowing questions and that sort of thing. But in survey research, it's a standard practice to use, it's called standardized questions, to use existing ways of asking a question because it makes it comparable to other studies. Often standard ways of asking a question have been well pre-tested, validated even, and so you're better off in many cases if you're using existing questions rather than inventing your own. But it all depends because you may be interested in something that nobody's asked about before. And then finally, another tip is to hook respondents with your first few questions. Make the beginning of the questionnaire interesting, easy to answer. That gets the respondent into the questionnaire and leads to better response. So another tip about crafting a questionnaire is to generally use more closed-ended questions than open-ended questions. And there's some examples given in the book. I would just say, I'm not going to go over those here, but just to say that closed-ended questions are easier, more accurate for people to answer. They provide data that's more readily analyzable. Open-ended questions can often be hard for respondents and also difficult to analyze because the written responses to an open-ended question can be very wide-ranging and inconsistent and difficult to code. So the basic message here is focus, for the most part, on developing closed-ended questions. Avoid open-ended questions unless they're really absolutely necessary. So the next thing to think about is the actual wording of questions. This is again, this is part art and part science. Now, I'm not going to go over all of this here because I think it's not efficient to do in this video lecture. I would just point you to the part of the book that deals with the specific sort of do's and don'ts of question wording. A lot of this comes from the work of Don Dillman, who is a very important survey researcher, and I would highly recommend his book for a more detailed treatment of it. He has a book on mail and internet surveys, which is in many ways one of the sort of standard texts in the field. We try to summarize some of his advice. What's interesting about Don Dillman also is that he does some very careful and rigorous experiments to actually show that some of these principles of question wording do matter, and so a lot of his advice is very much evidence-based. So these sorts of rules, I should also point out, are often sort of internalized by good survey researchers from many years of kind of working on surveys, but the attempt here is to try to articulate them for people who are new to the task of survey questionnaire construction. So it has to do with things like using simple words or using equal positive and negative categories and avoiding sort of overly technical language, that sort of thing. This list continues, using mutually exclusive response categories, avoiding double-barreled questions, and so on. So I'm not going to go over those here, but just to point you to that part of the book and have you read them. We give some examples for each of these and sort of the do's and the don'ts.